Welcome to those who are joining us. Nice to have you here. Today we're going to be talking about freelancers and the do's and don'ts of managing them, and going into some discussions around kind of how they work with you and your organisation, and navigating IR35. So welcome everyone. As you know, all our sessions are recorded and transcribed for those who can't make it, and we share clips on socials and other marketing channels. If you don't want yourselves to be identified, do just let us know. You can drop us a message in the chat, or you can separately message us after the session. So as we know, freelancers and contractors are a huge part of the creative business and help us get the work done, but the way they're brought in and managed isn't always ideal. So in today's conversation with Alexandra, we'll be opening some questions out to you, the audience, and going through some of the sort of intricacies of freelancers. We see freelancers kind of peak and trough in terms of use, and at the moment we're seeing an increase in the use, but there's some confusion from IR35 to blurred lines around control, pay, transparency and fairness. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, and whilst most organisations are trying to get it right, many are unknowingly creating risks for themselves and for the people they rely on. So this session is a space to unpack some of the common grey areas, share the questions we're hearing from across the sector, and explore what good actually looks like in practice. We're going to be shining a light on something often overlooked, psychological safety for freelancers, and what it really means when your workforce isn't technically your employee. So I'll ask a question to you lot in the audience. How many of you currently work with freelancers or contractors regularly? Hands up.
Not regularly, from time to time.
From time to time. Okay. And what's the one thing that confuses you about IR35 right now? Anybody? No one? Okay. IR35 is a thing we get here asked quite a lot about, so we're going to go into a little bit of detail about that. So I'm now going to quiz Alexandra and drill into her brain. So this should be fun. What are the definitions of IR35, Alexandra? I've heard that because we're predicted to make over 5 million next year, we should put everyone on IR35 that freelances with us. Is that actually a good thing to do?
So IR35, in summary, is a piece of UK tax legislation which was designed to basically identify situations where somebody's working like an employee but providing services through an intermediary, so usually a contract through a limited company, for example, or a personal service company, in order to gain tax advantages. So one of the key questions around this really is, if that intermediary didn't exist as such, would that individual who's been taken on realistically be considered as an employee for tax purposes? And that's where that comes in. If the answer to that is yes, then that's where the arrangement's likely to be inside IR35, and if no, then it could be outside of IR35. But there's the three biggest status tests attached to IR35, which are around control. So who decides how the contractor freelancer is working, when they're working, and where the work is done. The substitution factor, can they genuinely send somebody else in to do the work? Mutuality of obligation, so are you as the business obliged to provide the contractor with ongoing work? Are they obliged to accept it? They're the three big ones, but there are also other matters that go alongside it, which include financial risk, things like provision of equipment. So are you providing them with company equipment, or are they using their own? How they're being integrated into the business. the length and exclusivity of the engagement, exclusivity more, I would say, like, length is debatable. Whether they do actually operate like an independent business and are able to do that and have their say in how they're working for you. To come on to the second point of that question around the 5 million turnover, there has actually been a change to the off payroll IR35 rules, which came into force in April this year. So that means that a lot of businesses that were previously classed as medium-sized businesses will now actually be classed as small businesses and therefore become exempt from the IR35 off payroll working rules. So if we look historically, like up until April this year, any business in the private sector was considered as small if it met 2 of 3 categories, which were a turnover of 10.2 million or less, a balance sheet that totaled less than 5.1 mil, or 50 employees or fewer. So it's only 2 out of those 3 categories that need to be met to be classed as small. But from the 6th of April, 2 of those things have now changed. So the turnover is now increased from 10.2 million to 15 million, and the balance sheet totals changed, and that's increased up to 7.5 million now. The 50 employees or fewer is still the same, but again, you still only need to qualify for like 2 of those to be classed as small. So if you had more than 50 employees, but you're not turning over more than 15 million, you've not got a balance sheet total of more than 7.5 million, you would still be classed as a small organisation. A lot of businesses haven't fully clocked this yet, though. And the impact is quite significant. So it's estimated that around 14,000 businesses, which were previously classed as medium size under IR35 rules, are now going to be classed as small. And that's quite a significant shift, because if you are classed as small, then the responsibility for determining status generally stays with the contractor and their intermediary, as opposed to you and your business. If you don't qualify as small and you are classed as a medium to large, then that responsibility does shift to you as the client, as the employer, sorry, under the off payroll working rules. So that means that, you know, some businesses that previously thought they'd crossed into that medium large territory is likely to fall back into that smaller company exemption now, which is like a massive thing for SMEs in particular. You know, were or medium-sized studios who could have gone under that boundary. So that's mainly answers the question, but also it just, if you are a small business and if the contractor is the one who is determining status, it doesn't mean that the risk is completely removed from you just because you're not determining that status. HMRC can still clamp down on it. So it's important to reflect on how those working practices are actually happening, whether the agreements in place are not just legal agreements for the sake of them, but the actual practices and the operation side of things are working as they should do if a contractor is considering themselves as outside of IR35.
I mean, just this on its own, without going into any more of the questions that we've got, is a big thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's massive.
And I think this is something we get asked about quite regularly, isn't it, Alison? Particularly that kind of the tests, the kind of the financial tests for it. I don't know anybody else, but just listening to Alexander just then, my brain's just gone, wow, there's so much to digest about this one thing. So we are going to move on because we've got other questions, but if you want some more clarity on any of those points, just come back to us. There will be a transcript that comes out of this, so we can send that out to you for that clarity, but also if you kind of need any more kind of info from us, feel free to pick probably Alexandra's brain, because she's a lot more clear on this than me. Right. Why are freelancers seeing lower take-home pay than expected then, Alexandra?
So a few common reasons for this are where they are classed as inside IR35. So a lot of the, like larger businesses, global corporations and such, where IR35 is going to be a big determining factor with a lot of contractors. The problem is lots of companies today have been blanketing people as inside IR35 because of not really understanding how to determine the admin burden on it all, the not really wanting to go through the process of determining every single one of their contractors and where they stand. So for them, sometimes like the risk factor has been less to blanket, which shouldn't be the case. But because that has happened, and because a lot of people have been included inside IR35, lower take-home pay is like a massive thing, because essentially for a contractor, pay-wise, they're then being treated similar to an employee because they're getting deducted for national insurance, for tax, in a similar way to employees would, but they're not getting the benefits that an employee would. So their whole take-home pay is drastically reduced and they're getting no benefits alongside it. So that's why, yeah, there's an issue with that at the moment. The other side is that some will be working through umbrella companies, and they might not fully understand how that works. Because within an umbrella company, like they're the company that employs the contractor, handles everything like the payroll, the tax, the admin on their behalf. So instead of the freelancer invoicing through their own limited company, the umbrella company takes control of all of that. But sometimes it's not clear, and then the fees that come alongside that, the holiday pay, and like everything that kind of goes alongside it is further deductions that the contractor may not be aware of. Alongside that, I think touching on what I've just said, you know, market shifts are a massive contribution towards it, because of the way that people have either blanketed roles or tried to deal with people outside of IR35. They've then reduced rates to try and counteract it, or move to fixed budgets, which again has then impacted what the contractor will take home. Sometimes I think, coming back to the contractor themselves, there can be a bit of an unrealistic assumption sometimes if they're comparing when they've previously worked outside of IR35 to inside IR35 rates without accounting for the tax differences. So it's their understanding as well of the impact and how they need to accommodate it in the rates that they're asking for. But from a business side, obviously there's quite an impact there, because rates are going to increase considerably if they're needing to be inside IR35.
Yes, and I think it's important to put some sort of like real life clarity on some of this, because we know contractors who will work in that way, so they work on inside and outside IR35 in any given year. Well, if they've got a company of their own and they're doing that, they can be likely to pay up to 57% tax in any given year. So that's a lot of tax. That's more tax than millionaires are paying, basically, isn't it? So you know, it's just being kind of perhaps stepping back and having a little bit of thought about the systems that you're creating as well. So, okay, we're going to move on. Otherwise, we'll just be debating all day. Who is actually responsible for getting IR35 status right? So you just touched on this, but is it sort of the agency, the contractor, or the company?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, like, it does depend on the structure and the size of the business. So like I said, the medium to large size businesses will be responsible for assessing IR35 status. Alongside with that, you'd need to issue a status determination statement as well, and make sure that actual care and attention is taken during that assessment. It's not just a kind of a template thing. The agency would be responsible for deducting the tax where the role is inside IR35, but they're not responsible for determining status as such. Contractors would have determination factors when it's outside IR35 for a smaller business as such. Either way, the contractor still has a responsibility to make sure they're providing accurate information, that their intermediary is being operated effectively, that they also do still challenge where determinations might not be right, and not just going along with it because it might be in their best interests. Like I said before, HMRC can still clamp down where they think things haven't been determined correctly, whether that's through the business or the contractor.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you. So moving on, can we just hire a freelancer overseas as long as they invoice us?
If only it was so straightforward. No.
Again, another one we see quite a lot, isn't it? This. Yeah.
Is, I mean, obviously, like a lot of businesses, a lot of studios like operate with contractors based overseas. There's a lot of talent based there. So there is a misconception that's quite common that if somebody's based overseas and they just send an invoice and there's no risk attached because they're not part of the UK. There's a lot of stuff that goes alongside this, though. We're not just talking about the IR35 tax situation. It's about like their local employment laws, which are vastly different depending on which country they're based in. Their own worker classification rules, which are going to be vastly different to ours. Whatever those tax obligations are, things around whether there's permanent establishment risk, IP and data protection issues. I think that's probably like the main factors to consider, but there certainly is still risk there, and you need to be able to determine it in the right way. From the IR35 perspective, there's only, I mean, if there's a link in any way tax wise back to the UK, that's where that would still be an issue. But a lot of employers can unintentionally create exposures here without really thinking properly.
Yeah, we see that quite a lot. Well, the other thing that we see quite a lot is this the lack of consideration for IP.
Definitely.
So maybe that's something we can touch on in a different session. But the IP is critical, particularly with the global team.
Yeah, I mean, I'd always say like we're able to use an employer of record, so an EOR, because they will be able to deal with everything, regardless of what country that contract is based in. But obviously that comes with associated costs. So
yeah. Do your due diligence. That's interesting. Who knew? Okay, so sometimes we need to tell contractors specific periods that they can't take holiday. They can't take holiday in. So kind of dictating the holiday kind of periods, so to speak, due to a client or project demand. Is this okay?
This needs quite a careful handling. I would say it's probably how it's positioned. So I think you need to bear in mind that freelance contractors are generally expected to retain their own level of autonomy over how they deliver their services, and they tell you when they can and can't work. So if you are then dictating working patterns, asking to approve leave, requiring them to attend in the same way that your employees would, and almost setting patterns around kind of how, like, the hours that they're working and when they're available, that could all then strengthen the argument that they're more like a worker or an employee as opposed to a contractor. That being said, as a business, you can obviously still set your delivery expectations as part of that scope and availability requirements. But the safest approach really is to frame those requirements around the project delivery rather than classing it as holiday approval as such. So it's looking at those timelines collaboratively, like how can you work around when they are available, not available? What does that mean? Making sure that it's not, we need to approve your holiday, because that's not okay.
Yeah, and it's being mindful of setting them up like project timelines or something like that, so that you're not telling them the hours that they have to work, that they're telling you, so you can tell you that, and also then you've kind of got some structures around when you're using them. Okay, so we rely on freelancers for core roles. Is this
sorry, just before we go on to that, I just saw Sarah's just dropped a message in just about holiday. No, you don't pay contractors, freelancers holiday.
No.
Well, they don't get any benefits like that, which is why their rates are higher.
Or sick leave?
No, nothing like that. No.
No.
So it's just their, whatever you agree with them as their rate, that is what they're paid.
That's right. And they figure out the rest. So we rely on freelancers for core roles. Is that a structural problem?
Longer term, yes. So there's no legalities around this. So like there's no law preventing businesses from using contractors for core roles. But if you look at long-term reliance on contractors for your core business functions, that is going to increase risk in different areas. So not only the IR35 risk and the status, it's looking at like the business operational side of it. Like you've got dependency risks there, you've got a lack of clear internal progression frameworks, I guess, because you've got people who are not employees who are taking up those core roles. So how does that impact the rest of the team as well? That then feeds into things like your cultural well-being concerns, knowledge retention issues as well. If you've got somebody doing a core role who's not a permanent employee for you, I mean, the real questions to ask are around like what is the purpose of that role? Because essentially, if you've got a contractor doing it, it should be something that's project based. You know, you've got an end goal with it. Would the business struggle operationally if that person left suddenly? That's often a key indicator. Are you embedding them like a permanent employee? And are you just repeatedly renewing a freelancer agreement indefinitely, which again, Sarah, as you'll know, we see a lot, that they just keep getting renewed without any thought for it or what they're doing. Sometimes that's fine. Like if the scope has changed and there is a genuine need, there's different projects that they're involved in, that can be fine. But let's say it really depends on the situation around it and why you need them longer term, because otherwise it could indicate things like your resourcing gaps. It could be, you know, it could indicate things around the structural workforce planning side of it that's more of an issue. It could come down to hiring challenges that have happened historically but haven't been reviewed again. So it doesn't automatically make those arrangements unlawful, but it just does increase risk and opens up more difficulties for growth and development internally for the business as well.
I think it's just important to say, isn't it, that freelancers are absolutely fundamental. They're the heartbeat of the creative sector for sure, but they're not always the solution to your workforce. They're part of the workforce. They're not all of the workforce, and it's just it's something we do see from time to time with people that are businesses that kind of use freelancers because it's just easier and less of a risk, and it's just about kind of being mindful that you can't avoid people risk. Sarah, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick question on that, because having said at the beginning, I don't use freelancers all the time, just realised that I do use one all of the time, which is Tash. I just forget she's a freelancer. But we would only need someone, it's literally about a day and a half a week. That's really hard to employ someone for that. So I get that you shouldn't really just constantly keep freelancers, but if that works in terms for the business, what would you suggest? Because then I would potentially lose someone who's excellent and try to fill it with somebody who's prepared to work a day and a half a week and then fill the rest of their time working permanently for other people. It's not really a very good ask, is it?
Tash is more of a service provider, isn't she? So she.
Well, yeah, that's. I was messaging Izzy about this earlier. Like, where does contractor, service provider, and freelancers? Where does that overlap? You know, she gives me a service for that period of time, but we have her permanently.
Alexandra, over to you.
So when you say as a service provider, like, is she operating under like a consultancy or?
She's got her own company and she works for several other companies within the industry, and we just get her for a day and a half.
That's fine. Yeah, it's different. It's a different situation.
Right.
Yeah, and like you say, when it's an hour here and there, that is difficult. It's more like a plug-in service. that you need, as opposed to you're taking on a contractor for a project as such. So it's a different agreement, a different setup. But I'd expect the terms and conditions that you've agreed with her to be different to what you'd normally see for a contractor or a freelancer.
Right. Okay.
So
Yeah.
I'd
I'll double check that. Yeah, because she works set hours for us every week, so we know exactly when she's available for us.
Yeah.
But like her days are Fridays and Mondays, so quite often it's a bank holiday Monday, so then we don't get her. So yeah. So okay. Yeah. No. That.
Like different under that. Service provider category as opposed to a contractor as such.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's I think that's an important point. If you're working with freelancers in the capacity of, say, a bookkeeper or an HR provision or even a training provision, there are differences in terms of that service, in terms of how they operate. Perhaps we'll come to that at the end. But let's move on just for continuity here. But we can come back to that a little bit later. So before today, how many of you knew the small company thresholds had changed in April? Anyone? No. I don't think that was very well published. One might argue that HMRC wanted the money.
I think the problem with a lot of the legislation that's changed outside of the core ERA stuff has almost gone into the shadows.
For sure.
Because all the news has been about the ERA. So all these bits and pieces that are happening alongside that, again, missed and not seen as much. So
yeah, I think that's right. So how many of you engage with contractors overseas? And have you done any checks with them? Okay, that's good. Okay. Where companies go wrong, should freelancers have terms and conditions, Alexandra?
Yes, just like anybody else, they should have agreements in place. So not terms and conditions like an employee would, but you should have a clear written agreement in place before that work starts. So typically what we would like to see is that being in the form of a MSA, so a master service agreement, and then they would have an accompanying statement of work. So the statement of work would cover what the scope of the services are for that particular assignment. The MSA is the overriding T's and C's behind everything that cover, like the payment terms, the termination rights, confidentiality, IP, data protection, liability, all of that lovely stuff. Whereas the scope is more your deliverables, expectations, timelines, fee for that particular project. But they must link in and marry up together. Just be mindful that agreements alone aren't enough. You can have an amazingly drafted agreement, an SOW, that can be completely undermined by day-to-day behaviour if internally that person has been treated like an employee. Yeah. So all of that really does need to align together.
Yeah, and just on the insurance things as well, sometimes we see that particularly clients want to see scrutiny of insurance. So you do want to just scrutinise the freelancers have got insurance if they're doing something for you. So at what point does a freelancer legally become an employee?
There's no trigger point as such. It's like we've been discussing, it's the reality of the relationship as a whole. Mm-hmm. If we were to consider what tribunals would look at, that's going to be the control factors, the integration, the mutuality of obligation, their ability to refuse work, the exclusivity status, equipment, and they would look at the length and consistency of that engagement as well. So somebody won't automatically become an employee just because they've worked somewhere for a long time, but it's bearing in mind that the longer and more integrated that arrangement becomes, the harder it probably is to be able to defend it as genuine self-employment. If it's because the more integrated they're going to become into the business.
Yeah, and that's why we've seen some of those, you know, historically those sorts of things being challenged. Actually, I know some sort of big organisations locally to where I live, who I won't name because I might get in trouble. That has been an issue in the past. So you can see that that's, you know, happens in these bigger organisations. So if you're directing how, when, and where they work, is that already a red flag?
Yeah, potentially, because this all comes into that control factor. If you're controlling like the hours, the methods of work, location, processes, if they're being supervised and managed like an employee, that all looks like employment.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't. I think sometimes businesses get really confused by this and then say, well, how are we meant to know that they're doing a good job? How are we meant to like effectively manage them, but not as an employee? It doesn't mean that you can't set expectations and deadlines, you know, require them to collaborate with the team and have specific standards. But it's about, I suppose the difference is controlling the outcome of the work that's delivered versus the person delivering that work. So as an employee, you would be managing that person in the way they deliver it, as opposed to just the outcomes, if that makes sense. You know, that the contractors should remain autonomous in how their services are delivered. So it's just differentiating between those pieces.
I think it's important to say as well, usually in a master service agreement, there's a statement of work that goes with it, and that usually has some set boundaries around what your expectations are then for them to deliver. So where they don't deliver that, you've then got some way of coming back to them and saying, you're not delivering on this, and actually this is, you know, what options you then take, whether you continue working with them or not. It is then sort of much easier, I suppose, to manage, perhaps more clear cut in that sense.
Yeah.
So can someone be outside IR35 and still feel like an employee day to day?
Again, this is going to come down to bad practices internally. So if they're feeling like an employee day to day, then they shouldn't be outside IR35. I think the most common way that we see this happening is where there is more of that kind of line manager interaction.
Yeah.
It's not uncommon for us to see businesses referring to them managing, like properly line managing their contractors the same way that they do with employees, and then asking the question, what does that mean? Like, do we give them an appraisal? I'm like, no, like, you don't do that. They're not, they shouldn't be included in any of those formal processes, formal ways of working, any of those kind of frameworks. But yeah, unfortunately, we do come across it where they are managed in that way, and that's when these issues arise. They're risks that are created unintentionally, just through those everyday behaviours that unfortunately can easily trip from one person to the next. It's not a deliberate act of trying to get them to act as an employee as such. And sometimes the contractor themselves isn't aware either, so they go along with the flow and don't know any the wiser. So yeah, I would say if somebody feels like an employee day to day, then there's a mismatch there.
Yeah. And if you've had them with you for a while, there's a question then to be said. Actually, this is an employee, really, not a freelancer. So, which brings me nicely to the next question. So, if you had a contractor working with you for 18 months, is that risky?
Probably not so much at 18 months, because the length isn't the determining factor. But like we've already said, the longer the engagement is, the increased risks that come with that. I think like we've already said, it's just going to be based on assessing what's needed in that role. Is it still genuinely a project delivery role? Has that scope evolved over time? Are they starting to function more like part of the permanent team? Are they still able to decline work? Are they working for others? All of those things there, as opposed to it shouldn't just be looked at in terms of length of agreement and how long they've been working for you. It's all these other factors that come into it.
Yes, and I think that's really important to make that definition, because sometimes we hear this sort of lengths of kind of 4-year window of kind of as a test really of kind of like how long someone's worked with you as a freelancer or a contractor before they should become an employee. And although there are perhaps kind of periods by which you would be questioning if someone who was with you working on as a longer term in that way, they potentially are an employee. Actually, it's exactly as Alexandra said, there's some clear definitions. If this person is a subject matter expert and they're working with you on a longer period of time, but as long as you've defined those periods and that expectation about what their work is and their contribution is, the likelihood is they're not an employee. However, if they're working with you longer term and they're really just one of the team and you're kind of just sort of rolling with it and they're just sort of doing everything like an employee, they're probably an employee. But okay, so if a freelancer isn't working out on a project, how can you remove them? And could we potentially work with them again later down the line?
So this should relatively be quite easy if you've got a decent master service agreement and statement of work in place, because your agreement should be clearly setting out what the notice provisions are, what the termination rights are, any kind of breach clauses, the deliverables and expectations, and also what the dispute resolution process looks like. Then it should be quite easy to quickly remove somebody if they're not working out, whilst also remembering that obviously it's a human behind here and that these things still need proper communication in the best way so that they understand what's happening and like they're given opportunity to rectify something before. So there's no formal processes as such like you would see for employees. What I would say is the sensible approach is usually just raising any concerns that you're seeing early with the contractor, focusing purely on what those deliverables and expectations are that are set out in the statement of work. So you can refer back to them and say, well, this hasn't been met, or we're not near this deadline with what you're contributing at the moment, what's going wrong, like how can we rectify it? Still make sure those conversations are documented, but avoid any of that employee style performance management type of language. It's more just about working out how can you get them to deliver what you've asked them to deliver. If ultimately it doesn't work out and their relationship ends, then it's easily done through the notice periods in the agreement, and it's quick and relatively easy. In terms of working with them again, there's no legal issues with you engaging them again. I would just question what's gone wrong this time. What are you wanting to work with them again on the future? Like, is that a workable relationship? It depends on the reasons for why this one hasn't worked out. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah. And one thing you touched on that, but is the notice periods. Quite often we see that somebody might sort of terminate a freelancer without kind of really, giving consideration to that notice period or to, how that freelancer is going to get paid, might not even pay them. And apart from that not being a very nice way to behave, it's actually not lawful either. If you've got a terms and conditions with them, you've got to pay, you've got to honour it. So I'm kind of conscious of time, so we're going to kind of go through some of these. We've got a few more questions to go through before we sort of open this out, but can we include freelancers in team rituals, so stand-up, slacks, socials, that sort of thing, without creating a risk?
Yes, you can, but it has to be done in a thoughtful way, so not just include them in everything that's going on without any thought behind it. It's not automatically a problem, and doing completely the opposite, if you exclude them from too much, then that's obviously going to create poor communication, isolation, delivery issues because they're not involved. But it's all about proportion here. So when you've got things like project stand-ups, collab channels, access to necessary information, necessary groups, they're included in the project discussions, and that's all stuff we would expect to see and for them to be involved in. Where it becomes more high risk is if they're being included in everything that every other employee would be in every regard. So, you know, groups or meetings where there's no benefit to them, or if it's about employee focused things like benefits, perks, the company's changing stuff in regards to that, the contractors don't need to be involved in things like that. Like we've touched on before, if they start to become involved in like performance management frameworks, that's a big no. Requiring them to attend non-essential events, non-essential activities, things like that are necessary as well. So it's usually like asking yourself are we including them in stuff that's necessary for them to effectively deliver their role? Or are we, again, treating them like every other employee?
And it's also remembering that the social stuff is important, because that's kind of making sure that communication and trust is there. So it's not just about isolating them always, but they might not always be the first group of people that you invite. I think that's probably how to define that. Okay, we're going to move on to the next question, which is about training for freelancers. So what can we provide freelancers with training, and what kind of training might that be?
So this is an interesting one, because I think a lot of time people would never consider this. They would never consider that they would offer training to freelancers, because with everything else that we've been saying, it almost goes hand in hand in a thought process of, well, you don't provide them with benefits, you don't treat them like an employee, so why should they get training? So the thing to be mindful here is that in some cases you are going to be required to include them in training, especially now. So if we think of, for example, sexual harassment prevention training, they need that. So as a business, you need to be providing that to them. So the context around the type of training matters here. So things like that, things like where there's any relevant health and safety training, security, obviously things, you know, things that they need to know, like to do their job. So systems, compliance, ways of working, any project system, that type of stuff. They obviously need training on all of that. Where people think of training in terms of, for example, like line manager training or things that other employees would be eligible for, then no, you don't provide that. But where there is a legal obligation to do so, it's important that you do have that in place.
It's particularly important around health and safety, something like that, isn't it? As you say, sexual harassment prevention. Okay, so I'm going to open some stuff out to the audience now. Have any of you, how many of you have freelancers who've been with the business longer than some of your employees? Anyone? I can see some confused faces.
Only Tash, but I'm still a little bit confused, if I'm honest, about the differences between service providers and contractors and freelancers.
Yeah, because if I understand this correctly, Tash is bookkeeper, is that right?
Yeah, Tash. I pay her monthly for her
she
service.
Invoice you monthly?
Yes. Yeah.
And she's a bookkeeper. Are those hours rigid every month? So have you set those hours?
Well, we had her one day to start with, and then as we grew, we've got her for a day and a half.
Alexandra?
It's going to come down to the T's and C's. So if you want to send over the terms that you use with them,
I mean, to be honest, none of this is really a problem, really, because Tash kind of looks after our HR and to that level, and all our tax and HMRC stuff and everything anyway. And I do trust her with my life. But she's the only one that, others come and go. But I hadn't really thought about it till today. So we just she's on the website. She's like part of us, but actually she isn't.
Yeah, I honestly think she's fine under that service provision.
Yeah, I don't see a problem
about it. But yeah, send over what you've got, and I can just have a quick look just to put your mind at ease.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, we'll move on. So another question for any of you: what's usually driving long-term contractor reliance in your experience? Flexibility, hiring challenges, budgets, or speed? Alex?
Yeah, I think sometimes for us it might be where we just need like a specialist role for like say 2 months to come and do a specific project, and we don't you know, we don't have the need kind of for somebody on like a long-term basis, so we might like hire a contractor for that work or something like that. That's why we would kind of use somebody really. But actually I was going to ask a question. Is now a good time or should I leave it to the end?
Yeah.
So in terms of so obviously normal employees, we kind of onboard them a certain way. With contractors, you know, they've got the master service agreement and insurance and stuff like that. Is there anything else really that we should be getting that might be like totally overlooked or anything like that, that kind of when they start working for us?
I think there's always it's good to have a separate onboarding process for contractors and freelancers to employees. So, you know, similar to you'd onboard an employee, but not as intense, because they still need to get to know your ways of working, the systems that you're using, how they're going to integrate with the team, like who does what. So I think putting together some kind of onboarding pack that helps with that is always beneficial, to go alongside what you need to do legally with your agreements and everything. It just helps them to settle in a bit easier and a bit quicker, know who their touch points are, know what they're expected to do. Then you can just let them get on with it.
Okay. And in terms of right to work checks, so currently, so I've read in the guidance that you don't legally have to check them, but it's advised to. So we are checking our contractors on that basis at the moment. Is there anything else like that that potentially we might have to do, like in terms of, I don't know, things that we need to get when they start or anything like that?
No, I think you're doing the right thing. Like you said, you're absolutely right. There's no legal obligation to check right to work status for contracts and freelancers, but it's best practice. So you know what you're doing. You know if you're going to come up with any issues, if somebody potentially doesn't have the right to work, you don't want to get yourself into a pickle there. So yeah, keep doing that. I can't think off the top of my head of anything else that you would need to be checking. Obviously, if anything comes back visa wise, just make sure you have all that sorted as well, so you do know that they do definitely have the right to work. But yeah, legally you wouldn't be in any risk situation.
And for insurance, we ask the contractors if they've got insurance. If for example somebody doesn't have insurance, usually that would be a stumbling block for us, but is that something that you think because potentially, you know, they might have to go away and get it or whatever, but is that the right thing, do you think, in that case? Or... They should
definitely have it, yeah. And normally we'd expect to see that within the master service agreement. So you'd have specific clauses within there which would cover insurances and liability, both from the business side and the contractors side. If you need any help with that or clauses, just drop us a message. We'd be happy to help.
Oh, thanks. Yeah,
I've definitely seen historically with that, if you found someone who's really good and hasn't got insurance, or their insurance has lapsed, I've seen, like, you know, you give them a window of time to get it sorted, you know, get it sorted within 48 hours, for example. And if they don't, then you know it's a massive red flag. That's just the thing. You might be great on paper, but you're just not useful.
There will be big fluctuation, like especially for any contractors who are overseas. There will be big fluctuations with the limits on the insurance that they can get. But yeah, that's very kind of country specific. So
thank you.
No worries.
Okay, just before we finish, I'm just going to sort of talk about the human impact of managing freelance, which actually, I'll get my words out, which actually, Alex, speaks probably to some of what you were just saying about kind of how other things around onboarding freelancers. But so kind of a really good question is for you all is, can someone technically be a contractor but emotionally experience work exactly like an employee? What are your thoughts on that? Yeah, it's true. Like, you know, it's just because you choose a career as a freelancer doesn't mean that you don't have an emotional attachment to the work, firstly your career choices and also the work that you do. And sometimes you just see freelancers are really much more passionate about the client that they're working for, or the piece of work that they're doing, because it's perhaps more of a specific chosen route for their subject matter expertise. So how do we create an environment where freelancers feel comfortable raising concerns or challenging unrealistic expectations, Alexandra?
I guess so, like just been saying, the psychological safety part really matters for freelancers just as much as it does for employees. If we think, a lot of freelancers will feel more disposable, they'll feel less protected, a bit more hesitant to challenge any poor practices that they're seeing. Sometimes that might just be down to they're only there for a short period of time, they're going to do what they want to do and get out. Other times it can be, wider issues. I think this all really does come down to having that open, trustworthy and respectful communication norms. So to make sure your culture really says that from a communication point, that you are able to encourage any open dialogue early, and they can see that to make them more comfortable with raising any concerns as early as possible. I guess making sure anything that you're giving them as well is realistic, that you're not adding to unnecessary pressures by giving them unrealistic milestones or unrealistic timelines. Avoiding expectations that they're always going to be available. And I think that's an easy one for people to fall into with freelancers and contractors, assuming that they're always going to be around because of the way that they operate. Making sure there's clear escalation routes. So if anything is troubling them or there's issues, what's the next steps? And ask your feedback regularly. So I don't mean like having one-to-ones with them, because then we fall into that employee status, but just how they're getting on with things, and are they having any issues, like do they need anything? And you'll soon be able to see a pattern of like if that person's comfortable and they're able to get on well emotionally and they're integrating themselves in the best way, or if you can see something that's hitting them a bit harder. And again, that's down to training internally for managers and employees as to how they communicate with their freelancer community.
I think there's also a point to be said is your expectations here are not on the hours that freelancer is working within your hours. So freelancers kind of got the ability, in effect, to deliver outcomes. So it's more about outcomes than it is about hours and bums and seats, if you like. So if that freelancer isn't around at 10 o'clock in the morning for the stand-up, but they're still delivering the outcomes, then that's absolutely fine. Equally, is the case, unless, and this can come down to the statement of work and agreement that you have. Equally, they are okay to work on other projects. They're a freelancer, they can work on other projects with other clients. So you can't, it's about being mindful of the fact you respect that's their boundaries and the boundaries you set, and that you sort of show trust that they're sort of in what they're delivering. And obviously, if they then show that they're not delivering, you've got conversations that are a little bit more clear cut than perhaps with an employee in terms of how you manage that. But yeah, hopefully that's some clarity there. So just a couple more questions before we sort of end. But hang on, I've just lost myself. How can businesses encourage open communications with freelancers around workload, timelines? Well, I've just answered that. How do we balance commercial pressures with creating sustainable working relationships for freelancers, Alexandra?
It is difficult because obviously, within the creative industries, quite often working under like tight timelines, a lot of client pressures, budget constraints, and there's constant change there as well. But also unsustainable freelance practices can create longer term problems. Looking at things like burnout, talent attrition, reputational damage, reduced quality of work output, and an increased compliance risk as well. So I'd say like the better options are looking at more realistic project planning and workforce planning as a whole, better resource forecasting along with that, making sure you've got clearer defined scopes. Communication is always transparent and open. There's respect for their availability and their downtime as well. Engaging in like fair negotiation practices as well. That comes down to the communication part. Avoiding any, like overworking as well. And I think, like Sarah touched on briefly before as well, the thing around paying freelancers on time is a massive issue that we still see. Freelancers, like, invoices get unpaid and delayed so often, and it's just unfair practice. It's not good practice. It doesn't reflect well on the business either. The community talks, and nobody's going to want to work in the future for business who either don't pay their contractors or delay it by months.
Yes, and that's something we see quite a lot, and perhaps not so much in games actually, but certainly in other parts of the sector we see just really poor payment of terms, and it's not great. Okay, so I'm conscious that we're really near the end of time. So has anyone got any other questions for us before we finish, or anything they want some clarity on? Sarah, we'll pick up with you separately.
Yeah, thank you. No, that was really good. I'm afraid I've got another call, so I'm going to have to jump. There's a lot more to this whole subject than I thought. So there's a lot of food for thought there, but it's really good for us. And, if people come to us asking these questions, we know where to point them. Yeah, no, that was really helpful. Thank you.
No problem. Well, thanks.
Do you have like a written resource that you can share with us? Just because I'm more of like a visual learner, so that would be really helpful.
We don't have anything at the moment. Something we can look into though.
That'd be amazing, yeah. Just because I know that a lot of us on our team we benefit from hearing and being able to read and have that visual help. So that would be grand. Thank you.
No problem. No problem. I'm sure we've got some. I actually think we've probably got something somewhere. If you have any further questions around IR35 managing freelancers, or would be interested to hear more about our training or anything like that, you know where to find us. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
It's lovely to have you here. Take care,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
I didn't mention the next session. I will. Right. If I close. Open. I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving, Paul. It says don't leave, so I'm not leaving. Do I stop recording? Yes. Oh, help me.
Just close the browser.
Can I close it? It just told me not to.
Oh yeah, it'll stop recording automatically, so you can just
Right. So
you can do one.
bye then.
Bye.